Hello. Today's video I'm talking about nutrient density, and it's something that I've been talking to groups and clients about quite a bit over the last couple of years. Something that really interests me because I guess what really woke me up to something more being at play was when we went back milking cows in New Zealand for a couple of years, 2021, 2023. We were milking cows 3 times every 2 days, right through from calving, right through, and we would peak at about 28 plus litres, 2.4 to 2.5 kilos of milk solids a cow on just pasture, you know, not a kilo of meal being fed. And it just made me go, well, you know, how could cows sustain their nutritional needs for that sort of level of production, going into mating, 95% submission rates without any intervention, 70% plus conception rate to first service. All the parameters are good, you know, and there was not a kilo of meal being fed. And then came back to Ireland, and then I'm looking at things over here, and you know, there wouldn't be a farm that would think about feeding no meal at all going into mating time and doing that sort of production. And what is the difference, you know? So what can the pastures nutritionally sustain going through that peak production time? So it's very different in Ireland, I think, and in the UK than in New Zealand, in that you have much shorter day length in the winter. The grass is completely dormant, you know, maybe growth rates of 2 a day through the winter, and then coming into spring, your day length changes very quickly, and the pasture growth takes off quite differently than what I was familiar with in New Zealand, you know. So just on the client's farm here in Carlow, and every year growth rates would get up to about 120 to 150 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day for a few weeks. Not quite there yet at the moment, but have sort of hit 100 a day now. So what is it, the very end of April now, a couple of days left in April, and growth rates are sitting at about 100 a day here. And you know, I wouldn't have seen that in New Zealand in the past before, really. And you know, quite a different attitude to nitrogen use in Ireland and what it is in New Zealand as well. So, you know, the early nitrogen use, you wouldn't get a lot of response and growth in that first rotation, but certainly once your growth rates get up like this, all of a sudden that nitrogen that's built up in the soil and retained there flushes out at this time, and it just accentuates those high growth rates. Just like in ourselves as humans, we're probably consuming plenty of calories these days, but the nutrient density of the food that we're consuming is quite different, you know. So the wheat that's used to process our bread, 22 to 38% less nutrient, like rich as far as all the different nutrients. The fruit that we eat, the vegetables that we eat, you know, the varieties that are grown now are quick growing, a perfect looking fruit or vegetable, but they're not necessarily the same antioxidant levels and vitamin levels than what they used to have. So as humans, we're a lot less vitamin rich now for the amount of calories that we're consuming. And the same applies to the cows. So I would have in the past always talked about just 2 parameters for the cows really. It's energy and digestibility. So for every kilo dry matter pasture, if the energy levels are high and digestibility is good, so the cows can eat a lot of kilos of dry matter and there's a lot of energy per kilo dry matter, then that's all that counts. Whereas now I very much look at the 3rd parameter as nutrient density. So like at the moment, I'm going around with my refractometer and my garlic crusher. So I take a grass sample from in front of the cows and look at what their pre-grazing covers are measuring at, put it through the refractometer, squeeze a bit of juice out onto the refractometer, and I'm seeing a massive fluctuation in nutrient density, you know. So some of the farms that have applied a lot of nitrogen earlier on and are now sitting at 100 a day growth rates, I'm getting 2 and 3% Brix levels. And I was on a farm in Waterford there last week where we were running at 10 to 13. Where I am right now, where these cows are grazing, it is actually still quite a long time since they grazed this in the first rotation. So we're sort of right at the end of the second rotation now. So it's been 35 days since this was grazed, somewhere around there. And so it's had enough time to mobilize the solar energy, turn it into water-soluble carbohydrates, and exchange those water-soluble carbohydrates through the root system in exchange for nutrients, you know, and that all happens through root exudates. This is a farm that's, you know, quite a dry farm and you know, well drained farm, and therefore those roots are working quite efficiently. If you're on a very wet farm, then the effectiveness of your root system will be so much lower to go through that same process. So you know, you might find that that your nutrient density is a lot lower. So what the refractometer tells me is that the sugar levels, really, it bends the light through the refractometer to show you the Brix levels, and then that really is your sugars, but it's a really close indicator of nutrient density. So when we're talking about meal feeding, and you know, this client just did a visit, and they're feeding over 4 kilos a meal, and they've had a bit of a hammering about that these cows should be on a kilo. You know, like it's this fear of going into mating time with low meal feeding that the cows won't get in calf. But I think if the cows are consuming really good quality pasture, and you've got plenty of energy per kilo dry matter, and the nutrient density is also sitting at a good level, then we should have the confidence to reduce that meal feeding. Now, you know, in total there's 650 cows being milked here, dropping 2 kilos of meal per day out of the system, you know, 1.2, 1.4 tonne of meal out of the system. Obviously, it's a massive cost savings. And again, that isn't just saving the meal. Those cows, I just walked through those cows and they're really unhappy. They haven't grazed to anywhere near the residuals, and yet seeing me walk through had them bellowing. I find that if you're feeding a kilo a meal, those cows will be much more settled and graze to the right residual much more willingly. And that's the economics of that grazing behaviour. That's where the biggest impact comes, is that when cows are more settled into a grazing and rumination pattern without that high level of meal feeding, they will achieve residuals so much easier. It means less bales to mow, less having to go around with a mower to correct pasture quality. And you know, obviously you're saving money twice really, in the meal feeding and then the use of diesel. Going into mating time now, my concern is that in the next rotation here, if the growth rate's sitting at 120 a day, that the rotation's getting very short. And that's one of the greatest impacting factor on nutrient density, I find, is that your rotation length is the greatest indicator of what's likely to be going on in the plant. So if you're growing 120 a day and you're trying to graze at a pre-grazing cover of 1400 in Irish available terms, or 28 to 2900 in total terms, it means you're growing from your residual to your pre-grazing cover in 12 to 14 days. And that's where the concern is that the plant doesn't get time to rebuild the water-soluble carbohydrate levels and have that whole exchange going on through the root system. Also, that plant has to kill off root extremities when it first, after grazing, to reinitiate that growth. It has to kill off root extremities, and it hasn't had the opportunity to replenish that root structure again when you come around in 12 to 14 days. So what happens then is that your root structure gets even shorter. And I find that in Ireland is a huge issue, is that nowadays I find so many people talk about a drought. You go 2 weeks without rain and all of a sudden the grass doesn't grow anymore. And the greatest reason for that is that, you know, there's so much nitrogen being poured out and it's so much moisture in the soil, and we're on quick rotations, and you end up with a root structure that just lives in that top couple of inches in the soil, and you have no resilience in the plant because the plant can't access any deeper moisture because it hasn't got the root structure to access it. And it hasn't got that root structure to access nutrients and do that whole exchange process. So rotation length is a huge indicator, and like over here, I would have these cows eating a kilo meal a day. So these cows are doing about 2.4, 2.45 kilos of milk solids a day at the moment. Nutritionally, this pasture should sustain that level of production with a kilo a meal. But if your rotation length starts getting quite short, then my concern would be that the pasture would no longer do that. And it's just a consideration that not many people have, I suppose, is around nutrient density. You know, there is really the three parameters. It's digestibility of the pasture, you know, which declines obviously in the next few weeks. We'll be going into the reproductive phase of the ryegrass plant. You start seeing that stem coming into the bottom of the plant. So that's going to reduce the digestibility of that plant, and it's also going to reduce the energy per kilo dry matter of that plant. So that will see the cow's production falling back a little bit, because all of a sudden they're eating slightly less with slightly less energy, and the production will come back. But if that coincides with a very high growth rate where your nutrient density also declines, then my concern would be about nutritionally meeting demands of the cow and getting those cows and calves. So, you know, minerals are massively important through mating time, for everything to be right, for the viability of the egg, and for that egg to successfully adhere into the uterus to actually get the cow and calf. You know, those minerals are so important in that cow, and if we have those parameters wrong, then that's going to have an impact. How much meal you're feeding per se doesn't have an impact on reproduction of cows, you know, as long as nutritionally the pasture is right. My concern here is that it's quite different from New Zealand, where we do run really low nutrient levels, nutrient density levels, because the rotation length gets so short. So again, going back to farming in New Zealand where we were in Canterbury, our growth rates peaked at about 65, 70 a day, which meant that we were always on 20 to 22 day rotations. We never dropped below 20 days. So longer rotations allow that plant to interact through the roots and to take on the nutrients that the cow requires. So it's much more than just energy and digestibility. This then also connects to what's happening in the soil, and it's something that I'm going to go into to much greater depth in the future, because what we're standing on governs everything. You know, your soil health is one of the most important drivers of what's going on in the nutrients actually being available to that plant and being able to have that nutrient exchange with that plant. But primarily at the moment, going into mating time, I would very much look at nutrient density as being a guide to what you can get away with meal feeding and you know, nutritional intakes for the cows. Interestingly enough, when you go through a paddock and you have these really dark green spots, and you know, obviously that is a urine patch, and beside it looks almost anemic. You know, when you look at the pasture outside it. Now that urine patch has had a concentration of somewhere around, I don't know, 400 kilos of urea per hectare equivalent, or something like that, like a massive loading of nitrogen, and it's an ammonia nitrogen form in the urine. And so we look at that and we think, oh man, that's a great colour on the grass. The thing is, if I test that nutrient density in that urine patch, it's likely to come back at 2 or 3%. You test the nutrient density in the more anemic looking pasture, and it's today measuring anywhere from 8 to 10% on this farm. So and you know, if we can keep our nutrient density above 5%, we're doing quite well. If we're dropping well below 5%, I'll be concerned about meeting the nutritional needs of the cows over here. So fertilizer application does have a massive impact on these things as well. Working with a few people who are doing foliar, and again in the foliar I'm probably seeing nutrient density sitting 2 to 4% higher than the granular. I'm also getting into a habit of cleaning my refractometer after a sample by tasting the grass, and it's surprising how different the bitterness levels are of pasture on different farms. So very high granular nitrogen use farms, it's amazingly bitter. And then, you know, on the foliar you can taste the difference, and it's certainly evident in the way the cows' grazing behaviour. is, you know, on the foliar, the cows are more willingly grazing down to a lower residual. So certainly fertilizer or nitrogen application rates have a massive impact on the palatability and the nutrient density. For nitrogen to become plant available, it does have to grab hydrogen in the form of H2O, water to become plant available, and that process, of course, when you add water to things, it dilutes it. So yeah, you get a dilution of nutrient density, and so yeah, nitrogen use certainly has a huge impact on nutrient density. This is one of my big issues with this Irish fascination with early nitrogen use in spring. You know, like right through to the 1st of April, grass may have been able to mobilise somewhere around the, I don't know, 10 kilos of nitrogen per hectare by the 1st of April. It certainly wouldn't have been any more in this year's case. And people are applying probably up to 10 times as much as that from what I've seen. So the losses are huge. And then what is retained in the soil tends to flush out at a time when you're already in pasture surplus. So if you put what would be a fairly typical pasture growth curve up against a pasture demand curve, it's sort of like 3.2 cows per hectare, your pasture growth in the green and the pasture demand in the blue line. And then you look at this area over here is what concerns me, you know, in the spring calving system. This would be exactly the time that you're heading into mating, and that your pasture growth jumps from meeting demand to, you know, going up between 20 and 60, 70 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day in excess of pasture demand. And it's at this time that you'd be a little concerned about nitrate levels in that plant, going to short rotations, the impact on root structures, and yeah, overall the impact on mating. And when you look at this top end of the curve, the question revolves around, you know, is there a way of reducing that super high growth rate? And by reducing that super high growth rate a little, does that mean we'll create a little bit more resilience in that dip that we experienced once, yeah, had a bit of a dry spell? And definitely when you push growth a lot more by the use of nitrogen fertilizer, the impact that it has on root structures, without a doubt, then has an impact on pasture growth rates in this dry spell, because the root structures are not there to sustain the higher pasture growth rates. So accessing the moisture at that time at slightly deeper level. So we shouldn't be talking about maximizing growth, we should be speaking about optimizing growth. And optimizing growth means perhaps growing a little bit less at peak growth rates and growing a little bit more at times where we otherwise would be in deficit, or reducing that deficit somewhat. That, for me, is what it should all be about. So yeah, look, it goes in line with my spring nitrogen philosophy, which I'm well known for, I would think, and that, you know, we need to feed the plant more to try and maintain the right plant, rather than trying to, you know, push for as much growth whenever we can, and, you know, minimize the losses, maximize the value of that pasture going into the cows. So yeah, interested in any feedback or your findings, any questions around the use of the refractometer, or what you can do on your farm, yeah, I'll welcome it. And I'll do more on soil in the next few months, and perhaps come back to this nutrient density issue as our growth rates increase and we get onto shorter rotations.